The investigators were subsequently able to cut through the floor of the garage and to recover a bag, a plastic bag, containing what has been confirmed by the medical examiner's office as human remains.
In March of 2026, police tore open the concrete floor of a garage in Tyngsboro, Massachusetts, and found what everyone had been searching for 14 months. A woman's decomposing body sealed beneath the surface in the home of the man who killed her. But this was just the beginning. What started as a missing persons case would unravel into something far more sickening. A killer who confessed to a friend, casually like it was nothing. A 14-month silence where no one looked in the one place she actually was. And a town full of people who smiled at each other from their porches, grilled in their backyards on weekends, and never once suspected that beneath one ordinary garage floor, an unthinkable evil had been hiding in plain sight. The patch was what gave it away. A rectangle of concrete in the garage floor that didn't match the rest. Slightly different shade, slightly different texture, with edges that showed where something had been cut and filled back in. 5 feet long, 3 feet wide, the exact dimensions, give or take, of a human body laid flat. Investigators ran ground-penetrating radar across the full floor. When the signal passed over that rectangle, it returned an anomaly. Something was down there that shouldn't have been. They brought in saws. They cut through the concrete, and beneath the surface, sealed inside a plastic bag, they pulled out what the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner would confirm as human remains. Those remains had been there for over 14 months, and the man who lived in this house, who opened this garage door every morning, who parked his car over this floor, who walked across this exact spot on his way in and out of his own home, had known what was underneath the entire time. His name was Sean Sullivan. He was 40 years old. The woman beneath his floor was someone he called a friend. Her name was Jill Kloppenberg. And the story of how she ended up sealed in plastic under 5 inches of concrete begins not in a garage, but in a small apartment on a busy street in Lowell, Massachusetts, about 5 miles south of where her body would eventually be found. Jill Kloppenberg was living in a building on Broadway in Lowell. It was a temporary situation. She was staying with friends, people who had offered her a place when she needed one. Lowell is a working-class city about 40 miles north of Boston, the kind of place where people know their neighbors and check in on each other, at least when they can. Jill's life was not easy, and the people who knew her didn't pretend otherwise. Her uncle would later describe her publicly with a raw honesty that carried no pretense as a lost soul. She struggled with addiction. She had a history of relationships with violent men. These weren't things her family whispered about. They were the reality of a life that had been difficult for a long time. And the people closest to Jill spoke about her with the kind of love that doesn't need to edit the truth in order to be real. But Jill was also someone who had people, friends who took her in, family who thought about her, a Facebook page where she stayed connected. She wasn't invisible. She was present in the world, just drifting, slowly, with longer silences between the check-ins and wider gaps between the visits. The kind of drift that happens gradually enough that you don't always notice the distance growing until it's already grown. Her friends on Broadway, the ones she was staying with, hadn't physically seen Jill since August of 2024. They'd traded texts, the last one on November 20th. After that, the thread went quiet. A few weeks, then a month. When you're used to someone going off the radar for stretches, you wait. You tell yourself she'll surface. You tell yourself she always does. And then January came. On January 2nd, 2025, Jill Kloppenberg was seen leaving her building on Broadway in Lowell. She stepped outside into the cold Massachusetts winter, and that was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Her phone remained active for 12 more days. The final recorded use was January 14, 2025, and then the signal went dark. No calls, no texts, no location pings, no financial activity. The digital trail that every living person leaves behind simply stopped, like a sentence cut off in the middle of a word. Jill had gone quiet before. That was part of the pattern. But this quiet was different. This one didn't end. Her friends reported her missing in February, a full month after the last sighting. That gap wasn't neglect. It was the painful mathematics of loving someone who drifts. When silence is normal, you don't always recognize the moment it becomes permanent. You don't know when "I haven't heard from her in a while" crosses the line into "I will never hear from her again." By the time you realize you've crossed it, the line is already behind you. Law enforcement opened an investigation. They checked her phone records, her financial history, her known contacts. The FBI got involved. Her face was posted on the FBI's website, her name, her number to call. And then the case hit the wall that cases like Jill's almost always hit. She was an adult. There was no evidence of abduction, no witnesses to violence, no scene crime, no body. Missing adults, especially those with complicated histories, often go missing voluntarily. Without something concrete pointing toward foul play, the protocol is predictable. Basic inquiries, digital forensics, outreach to contacts. And when those leads dry up, the case gets entered into a database and it waits. Jill Kloppenberg's name sat in the National Missing Persons System for over a year. Her face stared out from an FBI website. Somewhere, people were still thinking about her, still wondering, still hoping she'd turn up. And 5 miles from where she was last seen, beneath a patch of concrete in a quiet residential garage, she was already gone. The case was ice cold. And then a phone rang in New Hampshire. On March 10, 2026, the Nashua Police Department, about 30 minutes north of Lowell, received a call that changed everything. The caller said he was a friend of a man named Sean Sullivan, and what Sullivan had told him was specific enough to stop the conversation cold. Sullivan had said he killed a woman. Her name was Jill. It happened in or around January of 2025. He'd shot her, and he'd buried her body beneath the floor of his garage at his home on Audrey Avenue in Tynesboro, Massachusetts. That's not a vague rumor. That's not a hunch. That's a name, a method, a date, and a burial location. The kind of detail that doesn't come from speculation. The kind of detail that only comes from someone who was there. Nashua PD ran the name through the missing persons database. Jill Kloppenberg came back immediately, missing from Lowell since January 2025. They cross-referenced Sullivan. He lived in Tynesboro, 5 miles from her last known location. They checked social media and found something that made the connection impossible to ignore. Sean Sullivan and Jill Kloppenberg were friends on Facebook. They were described by people who knew them as friendly, at least to some degree. She had been to his house before. She had been around him near the time she was last seen. Everything aligned. The tip was credible. And now the only question was what investigators would find when they opened that garage floor. What remains unknown and may never be fully answered is why Sullivan told his friend at all. Was it guilt, building slowly over 14 months until the pressure cracked him open? Was it a drunken slip, a confession that escaped when his guard was down? Or was it something colder? Bragging to someone he trusted, testing the words out loud to see how they sounded. The tone of that conversation hasn't been made public. But whatever drove Sullivan to speak after 14 months of silence, the person he told did something Sullivan clearly didn't expect. He picked up the phone and called the police. 5 days later, investigators were standing in Sullivan's garage with a search warrant and a saw, and the rectangle in the concrete was waiting for them. On March 15, 2026, detectives from the Tyngsboro Police Department, the Tewksbury Police Department, and the Massachusetts State Police executed the warrant. They walked into the garage and found exactly what the tipster described: the patch in the floor, 5 feet by 3 feet, smooth but visibly different from the surrounding concrete. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the anomaly. They cut through and they recovered the plastic bag containing human remains. Sean Sullivan had lived in this house for the entire 14 months since Jill's disappearance. He had walked over that floor to get to his car. He had come home at night and stepped across it in the dark. He had existed, eating, sleeping, going about his days in the same structure where a woman he knew was decomposing beneath a thin layer of concrete and plastic. And during those 14 months, Jill's friends and family hadn't stopped looking. Her name was in federal databases. Her picture was on the FBI's website. People who cared about her were still asking questions, still checking, still hoping. And, according to reports, some of them had actually come to Sullivan's door. They came carrying missing person flyers, flyers with Jill's face on them. They were looking for her. They wanted to know if he'd seen her. He answered the door. He looked at them. He looked at the flyer. And he said nothing. He closed the door and walked back inside, back across the garage floor, back into the house where she was buried. And he kept the secret for another day, another week, another month, until he told his friend in New Hampshire, and the whole thing came apart. The Middlesex County District Attorney initially classified the remains as a Jane Doe, standard procedure pending DNA confirmation. But investigators told Jill's family privately that they were certain. After 14 months of silence, there was finally an answer. It was not the answer anyone had been hoping for, and the story Sullivan would tell about how it happened, that story was about to make everything worse. Sullivan's first court appearance was at Lowell District Court on a Tuesday in March 2026. He stood before the judge with his head down for the most of the hearing, looking by all accounts sad and distraught. His attorneys positioned themselves between him and the courtroom cameras, blocking the footage for the majority of the proceeding. The charges were read: murder, assault and battery with a dangerous weapon causing serious bodily injury, improper disposal of human remains. The prosecution stated that Sullivan had admitted to law enforcement that he was the person who fired the gun that killed Jill Kloppenberg. That fact was not contested. And then came the turn that nobody expected. Sullivan's attorney did not deny that his client pulled the trigger. He didn't argue that Sullivan wasn't there. He didn't claim mistaken identity or self-defense. What he argued was that this wasn't murder. It was an accident. And the charge, he said, was manslaughter. Here is the account Sullivan and his legal team presented. Jill was at his house that night. At some point, Sullivan went to a safe, retrieved a firearm, and took it out to show her. He claims he was either drifting off to sleep or made some kind of involuntary twitching motion, and the gun discharged. The bullet struck Jill in her chest and passed through her body, exiting out her back. And what happened next, in the words of Sullivan's own lawyer, was an inexcusable panic. That word needs to be examined, because what the evidence describes in the hours and days after that gunshot does not resemble panic, not by any definition that means anything.
Jill Kloppenberg did not die immediately. That single fact restructures everything. She was wounded. She was still alive. And in that window of time, however long it lasted, there existed a version of this story where Jill survives. A version where Sullivan picks up his phone and dials 911, where an ambulance arrives, where doctors work on the wound that went through her chest and out her back, and maybe she makes it. Sullivan did not make that call. He did not attempt to stop the bleeding or render any kind of aid. He did not run to the other occupants of his home because he shared this house with other people and tell them what happened. He did not knock on a neighbor's door. He did not drive her to a hospital. He did nothing that a person does when someone they supposedly care about is dying on their floor, and the death was genuinely an accident. Instead, according to the prosecution, Sullivan kept Jill's body in his bedroom. Not for a few hours, not overnight, for days. Multiple days, with her remains in the room where he slept. Days in which he had every opportunity to reconsider, to pick up the phone, to walk into a police station and ask for help. He chose not to. Every single time, he chose not to. And then, he did something that goes far beyond anything the word panic can hold. He went to his garage. He cut into the concrete floor. He excavated a space large enough for a body. He wrapped Jill in plastic. He placed her in a bag. He lowered her into the ground. He filled the hole. He patched the surface smooth. And then he went back upstairs and continued living his life in the house where she was buried. For 14 months. 427 days of waking up, making coffee, watching television, coming and going, all of it taking place above the floor where Jill Kloppenberg was sealed in a bag in the dark. 427 days of knowing exactly where she was while the people who loved her searched and wondered and waited for a phone call that never came. And then, the flyers. People came to his door with her picture. He opened it. He looked at her face printed on paper. He looked at the people holding it, people who were desperate, people who still believed she might be alive somewhere, people who were asking him directly if he had seen her. He had not just seen her, she was beneath his feet. He closed the door, he went back inside, and he said nothing. His attorney calls this panic. But panic is a heartbeat. Panic is a minute, maybe 10. Panic is the immediate, unthinking aftermath of something terrible when your body floods with adrenaline and your brain goes dark. What Sullivan did lasted over a year. That is not a reflex. That is a decision made again and again, every single day, for 427 days. There's something else worth knowing about Sean Sullivan. On his Facebook page, the same page where he was connected to Jill Kloppenberg, where their friendship was visible to anyone who looked, Sullivan listed his area of study. He was, according to that profile, a criminal justice major at Worcester State. Criminal justice, the investigation of crimes, the collection of evidence, the prosecution of offenders, the exact system that would eventually cut through his garage floor and find what he'd hidden. That detail doesn't prove intent, but it raises questions that are very difficult to answer with the word panic. When Sullivan wrapped Jill in plastic before burying her, was that an instinctive reaction, or was it the decision of someone who understood, at least in theory, that forensic evidence degrades differently depending on how a body is stored? When he cut the concrete cleanly and patched it smooth, rather than leaving a rough, obvious disturbance, was that the trembling work of a man in shock, or the deliberate effort of someone who knew that a visible anomaly would attract attention? There is also the matter of his statement to police. Investigators have indicated that Sullivan's account of the shooting did not arrive fully formed. It reportedly evolved over the course of multiple conversations, shifting, clarifying, adjusting as the questioning continued. He didn't sit down and immediately offer a clear, consistent narrative. The story came out in pieces. Experienced investigators know what that pattern tends to mean. When someone is telling the truth about something traumatic, the core of their account remains stable even as peripheral details emerge. When someone is constructing a narrative, it bends under pressure. The deeper the questioning goes, third level, fourth level, fifth level of detail, the more the fabrication strains. The emotional load of maintaining the fiction begins to show. The timeline softens, the story stops making sense. Whether Sullivan's version holds under that kind of sustained scrutiny is something the legal system will determine. But the evidence that matters most won't come from his words alone. It will come from Jill. Her body is, in the most painful sense, a crime scene of its own. The trajectory of the bullet, entry wound in the chest, exit wound through the back, tells a story about the angle of the shot and the relative positions of the two people in that room. Was the angle consistent with a gun going off accidentally while being held casually? Or does it suggest something else? A different posture, a different distance, a different intent? Firearms discharged at close range leave measurable evidence: stippling, powder burns, contact signatures. If those characteristics are present and preserved, they'll establish approximately how far the muzzle was from Jill's body when the weapon fired. A gun that slips during a drowsy showing off produces a different forensic signature than a gun aimed and discharged with purpose. The plastic Sullivan wrapped her in may have, in a grim irony, preserved evidence that would otherwise have degraded over 14 months underground. And inside the house itself, even a year later, blood has a way of persisting. It soaks through carpet. It seeps into floorboards. It settles into seams and cracks that no amount of surface cleaning can reach. Where that blood is found, in which room, at what height, in what pattern, will either confirm Sullivan's account or contradict it. The forensics will tell their own version of what happened in that house, and unlike Sullivan, they won't change their story between conversations. When investigators confirmed what they had found beneath Sullivan's garage, they had to tell Jill's family. Her uncle described the moment on Facebook, writing with a rawness that carried no performance and no polish. A police car pulled into his driveway. An officer came to the door, asked to come in, mentioned his niece's name. That is how 14 months of wondering ends, with a uniformed stranger standing in your living room, saying the words you spent a year hoping you'd never hear. The uncle wrote about Jill the way you write about someone you loved, honestly rather than perfectly. He didn't deliver a eulogy. He didn't smooth the edges. She was a lost soul, he wrote. She had problems with drugs and picking violent men. And now, though we were not particularly close, I find myself walking around since, with eyes watery on the edge of tears for her loss. For what could have been. For what could have been. That phrase carries everything this case means inside 5 words. Not just grief for a woman who was killed, but grief for every version of her life that will never happen now. The version where she gets clean, the version where she finds stability, the version where she rebuilds slowly, year by year, and becomes someone who tells the story of the hard times from the other side. Every one of those possible futures was taken, first by a bullet, and then by the concrete that was poured over the truth. He also wrote one more line: "There will be a resolution."
Will there? Sean Sullivan was held without bond. He's due back in court on April 17, 2026. The charge is murder. His defense says manslaughter. A jury will eventually weigh the forensic evidence, the testimony, the timeline of concealment, and the story that reportedly shifted each time Sullivan was asked to tell it, and they will render a verdict. But beneath the legal question, there is another one, and it is the question that this case will leave with you whether you want it to carry or not. Assume for a moment that Sullivan is telling the truth. Assume the shot was accidental, a moment of stupid, reckless carelessness where a loaded gun discharged because a man was drowsy or twitching or showing off. Grant him that. Give him the most generous possible reading of the worst moment of his life. Now look at what followed. He did not call for help while she was still alive. He kept her body in his bedroom for days. He cut a hole in his garage floor. He wrapped her in plastic. He placed her in a bag. He buried her beneath the concrete. He smoothed the surface.
He lived above her for 14 months. He answered the door when people came looking for her with her face on a piece of paper. He looked at them. He closed the door. He walked back across the floor. He did it again the next day, and the next, and the next, for 427 days. At what point does what you do after become indistinguishable from the thing itself? Because even if the bullet was an accident, the silence was not. The silence was a choice Sullivan made every single morning when he woke up in that house and chose not to speak. And that silence had a cost. It cost Jill any chance of survival. She did not die immediately, which means there was a window where medical help might have changed everything. It cost her family 14 months of agonizing uncertainty. It cost her the basic human dignity of being found, identified, mourned, and laid to rest by the people who loved her. Sullivan's attorney calls what happened after the shooting an inexcusable panic. The law will determine whether it was manslaughter or murder, but there is a space between those two words where something harder to name exists. The space where you choose your own freedom over another person's life, over their family's right to grieve, over the simple, irreducible obligation to say out loud what you have done. And you make that choice not once in a flash of adrenaline, but every single day for over a year. The shot lasted a fraction of a second. The silence lasted 14 months. And I don't know exactly what the right word is for 14 months of letting a woman decompose beneath your garage floor while the people who love her search the streets with her picture. But I know it isn't panic. Jill Kloppenberg's uncle said she was a lost soul. Maybe she was. But lost souls still deserve to be found. They deserve a phone call to 911 when there's still time. They deserve the chance, however thin, however uncertain, to survive. They deserve to be grieved openly and buried with care by the people who loved them, even the ones who weren't particularly close. They deserve more than a plastic bag and a patch of concrete and 14 months of silence from the man who put them there. The floor in Tungsboro has been broken open now. The concrete is cracked. The secret is out. But there is a question still buried underneath this case, and it doesn't have a clean answer. It's the question the jury will sit with, and it's the question I'll leave you with tonight. If the bullet was an accident, was everything after an accident too? I know what I think, but I want to know what you think. Sean Sullivan is due back in court on April 17th, and Jill Kloppenberg, after 14 months sealed in the dark beneath the floor of the man who killed her, is finally in the light.